The light in colonial America arrived and departed on schedule, and before gaslight or electrical illumination had altered the relationship between human beings and the hours of darkness, that schedule governed nearly everything else about the way daily life was organized. In 1720, the town of Boston held approximately 12,000 residents within an irregular network of streets, many of which had first been worn into shape by cattle moving between pasture and harbor long before any surveyor had thought to impose a plan. Wood smoke rose from every household chimney between October and April, and at dusk the harbor wind carried salt across the rooftops along with the low, persistent smell of the horses and hogs that moved through the same unpaved streets as their owners. Candles were expensive enough that most households used them sparingly, and the firelight that served as the primary illumination for long winter evenings cast warmth in one direction and deep shadow in every other. The daily life conducted within that light operated according to a logic entirely coherent to those who lived it and almost entirely foreign to the world that replaced it. Colonial customs around sleep and drink, medicine and law, marriage and death were not the product of ignorance alone, though ignorance was present in some measure. They emerged from specific physical environments, from institutional frameworks carried and adapted across the Atlantic, and from material limitations that shaped human behavior in ways that appear, at a distance of several centuries, to be strange or even invented. When those constraints are examined, the strangeness tends to resolve, not into simplicity, but into a different and more textured kind of complexity. For those who find these long, unhurried histories a useful companion for quiet evenings, subscribing to this channel ensures that new documentaries will arrive without the need to search. What follows is a close reading of that world, an examination of a society whose built environment, legal institutions, and inherited beliefs produced a daily life that was, by almost every modern measure, profoundly unlike anything that has come since. The night hours in a colonial household began earlier and lasted longer than at almost any other period in American history, and what unfolded within them was organized according to a pattern of sleep that has since been so thoroughly erased by artificial illumination that its existence required more than a century of historical scholarship to recover. For most colonists in New England, the Middle Colonies, and the South throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, the night was divided into two separate and distinct sleep periods with a period of natural wakefulness between them. The first sleep began shortly after dark, often between 8 and 10 o'clock in the evening for households that followed agricultural rhythms, and lasted for approximately 3 to 4 hours. Then, somewhere in the middle of the night, typically between midnight and 2 in the morning, the sleeper would simply and naturally wake. Not because they had been disturbed, not because something had gone wrong, but because the body's architecture, in the absence of artificial light and the hormonal disruptions it produces, organized the night that way. After this waking period, which could last anywhere from half an hour to more than an hour, the second sleep would follow, carrying the sleeper through to dawn. This waking interval, called variously the watch, the nocturnal watch, or simply the time between the sleeps in the documents of the period, was not understood as insomnia or as any kind of disruption. It was recognized as a natural and expected feature of the night, and colonial diarists, physicians, and letter writers referenced it with the same matter-of-factness they applied to tides or to seasonal frost. The planter William Byrd II of Westover, Virginia, one of the most diligent diarists in colonial American history, recorded waking in the night regularly across the thousands of entries in his journals from the years 1709 through 1712, using the quiet hours for private prayer, for reviewing the accounts of his plantation in his mind, and occasionally for what he described, in his characteristic shorthand as visiting his wife. Cotton Mather, the Puritan minister of the Second Church of Boston, recorded his watch period as a space of particular spiritual intensity, the quiet between the sleeps being, in his understanding, a time in which God's voice could be heard with less interference from the noise of the waking day, and in which the conscience, stripped of its daily distractions, was most clearly visible to itself. The historian A. Roger E. Kirch, drawing from more than 500 historical sources accumulated over more than a decade of research and published in his 2005 book At Day's Close, Night in Times Past, documented this biphasic sleep pattern across diaries, medical texts, court records, and literary sources from England, France, and the American colonies. The pattern appears in Geoffrey Chaucer, who referenced the first sleep in the Canterbury Tales as a recognizable feature of the night. It appears in the household records of Renaissance Florence and in the plantation journals of colonial Virginia with the same unreflective casualness. Not as something being described for the first time, but as something simply present in the texture of ordinary experience. What Ekirch also documented was its disappearance. References to first and second sleep vanish from the historical record in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, correlating with the expansion of artificial street lighting in European and American cities and, later, with the spread of gas and electrical illumination into private homes. The consolidated 8-hour sleep block of modern life is, in this reading, not the default condition of human biology, but the product of a specific technological intervention in the architecture of the night. The physician Thomas Cogan, writing in England in 1584 in his Haven of Health, described the period between first and second sleep as most profitable for clear thinking and religious contemplation, and noted that persons who rose during this interval for prayer or reflection were following the natural design of the body rather than violating it. The French physician Laurent Joubert, whose Popular Errors appeared in 1572, wrote of the watch period with the same settled confidence, observing that those who used the waking hours productively found themselves refreshed rather than depleted when the second sleep arrived. Colonial American references carry the same tone of normality. The watch is mentioned in passing, as the hour when a particular scripture was read or a particular letter written, with no sense that it required explaining to any reader who might encounter it. What the colonial household did during the watch depended on the household, the season, and the temperament of its occupants. Some prayed, kneeling at the bedside in the cold of an unheated room. Some smoked a pipe, sitting at the edge of the bed with the curtains drawn back. Some rose entirely, going to the kitchen to sit by the banked fire and write by the light of a single candle. The quiet watch being, for those colonists inclined to letter writing or journal keeping, one of the more reliable windows of solitude that the densely occupied colonial household provided. Some, in the closely settled neighborhoods of Boston or Philadelphia, visited a neighbor. A detail that appears in several colonial court records as the explanation offered for why a particular person had been observed crossing a particular street at 2 in the morning, the magistrate apparently finding the explanation sufficient. Dreams that occurred during the watch period, or in the second sleep that followed it, were understood in colonial popular theology to carry special weight, being closer in the scheme of divine communication to genuine revelation than the dreams of the first sleep, which belonged more entirely to the workings of the mortal body. The built environment of the colonial household shaped all of this: the timing of the sleep, the rituals of the watch, the social arrangements of the night. And no aspect of that built environment shaped colonial sleeping habits more completely than the simple fact that most colonial homes, for most of the colonial period, were composed of 2 or 3 rooms, only one of which was consistently heated, and that the concept of a private sleeping space, sealed off from the rest of the household and its inhabitants, was a material luxury entirely beyond the reach of the great majority of colonial families. In New England and Pennsylvania, and to a lesser extent in the Middle Colonies, the practice of courtship bundling, known in some communities as tarrying, was a widely accepted and institutionally recognized way for a courting couple to spend time together in the presence and hearing of the household. When a young man came to court, a young woman, and the evening grew late, the practical arrangements of the home presented a problem of both comfort and propriety. No heated parlor existed, in which the couple could sit separately from the family. No fire could be maintained through the night in an unused room, and the alternative of sending the young man back out into a New England February midnight on a journey of several miles was neither safe nor, in the social mathematics of the colony, particularly hospitable. The solution, in many households, was to permit the couple to share a bed for the night, separated by a bundling board. A wooden plank set lengthwise down the center of the mattress, dividing it into 2 distinct halves. In some households and communities, the arrangement was further formalized by placing the young woman in a bundling bag, a full-length fabric sack into which she was placed and sometimes sewn before the young man joined her, ensuring that whatever happened in the dark, the physical boundary remained structurally intact. The Reverend Samuel Peters, an Anglican minister who documented New England customs in his 1781 General History of Connecticut, described bundling as so thoroughly established in his region that it had acquired its own recognized social protocols. The bundling board was a piece of regular household furniture kept in a specific location, its production the formal acknowledgement that an evening of courtship had been authorized by the household. Jonathan Edwards, the Congregationalist minister of Northampton, Massachusetts, preached against the practice in the 1740s, and the fact that he did so from the pulpit of one of the most prominent churches in the Connecticut River Valley is itself a measure of how widespread the custom was in his community. Not a marginal eccentricity, but a recognized social institution. Present enough in the fabric of daily life that it required a minister of his standing to address it publicly. The historian Henry Reed Stiles, who published a detailed study titled Bundling: Its Origin, progress and decline in America in 1869 traced the custom across New England through the German and Welsh immigrant communities of Pennsylvania and into the Dutch communities of the Hudson Valley in New York, finding in each region the same institutional logic at work. The cold, multi-purpose, inadequately heated domestic space that made any other form of supervised evening courtship impractical. What the arrangement sounds like, described at a distance of several centuries, is not quite what it appears to have been in practice. The house was not empty. The bundling couple was surrounded by sleeping parents, siblings, and in many households, boarders or servants, most of them in the same room or in an adjacent one separated by at most a thin plank wall or a curtain. The social cost of violating the understood terms of the arrangement was immediate and severe in communities where reputation was a primary economic and social asset. Church records from several New England communities document pregnancy rates among courting couples who bundled at levels roughly comparable to those associated with other forms of supervised courtship, a figure suggesting that the social and physical architecture of the bundling arrangement was, on balance, an effective institution. The custom illustrates with particular clarity the channel through which domestic architecture creates domestic behavior. Wherever a heated private parlor existed, courtship moved into it. Wherever it did not, the household adapted its norms to what was available. The shared bed, in colonial life, was not confined to courtship or to the family unit. Sharing a bed with strangers was an entirely ordinary feature of travel across colonial America, and travelers who assumed otherwise were quickly educated by the realities of the colonial road. At inns and taverns throughout the colonies, from the Blue Anchor Tavern in Philadelphia, one of the oldest public houses in the city and a landmark of Penn's settlement from the 1680s, to the Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg, Virginia, established in the 1720s and serving as the de facto center of political and commercial life in the colonial capital. The standard accommodation for a single traveler was not a private room and not a single bed, but a place in a shared bed alongside one or more persons entirely unknown to them, of whatever social condition happened to be traveling the same road that day. The innkeeper allocated beds by practical necessity, filling them as the evening's arrivals required, and in periods of heavy travel, court sessions, market days, election weeks. A single bed might hold 3 or 4 travelers lying side by side, an arrangement about which the documentary record suggests remarkably little complaint from those accustomed to colonial travel. The Swedish botanist Peter Kalm, who traveled through the American colonies between 1747 and 1751, and published his detailed observations in a 3-volume work titled Travels into North America, noted with mild curiosity that American innkeepers saw nothing exceptional in the arrangement, and that their guests appeared largely untroubled by it. The discomfort documented in most travel accounts of the period belonged to the European observer, not to the colonial participants for whom the shared bed was as unremarkable as the shared table or the shared road. The most precisely documented instance of involuntary shared sleeping among the architects of the American Republic appears in John Adams's own diary. In September 1776, Adams and Benjamin Franklin were traveling together from Philadelphia to Staten Island for peace negotiations with the British Admiral Richard Howe, and lodged overnight at the Brunswick Inn in New Brunswick, New Jersey. The room assigned to them was small and contained 1 bed and 1 window, which was already open to the night air when they arrived. Adams moved to close it, fearing the effects of night air on the lungs, a concern entirely consistent with the medical understanding of the period, which attributed respiratory illness to the inhalation of harmful vapors rather than to any microbial cause. Franklin, already settled in the bed, objected and proposed instead to explain why cold air did not cause colds. The mechanism, in his view, being not temperature, but the contaminated breath of other people, a theory that anticipated by roughly a century the germ-based understanding of respiratory infection. Adams recorded in his diary that he listened to Franklin's explanation with genuine interest until he fell asleep, the window remaining open above them, the argument settled by the simplest means available. One party ceased to be conscious. The anecdote is frequently repeated for its picture of 2 great men bickering in a shared bed over a window. What it also conveys, without any commentary required, is that the arrangement itself, 2 men of continental reputation sharing a room and a bed at a country inn, was approached by both of them as a simple fact of travel, requiring no acknowledgement of awkwardness and certainly no apology from the innkeeper who had arranged it. The bed itself, the physical object, the mattress and its frame and curtains and linen, occupied a place in the material economy of the colonial household that is difficult to appreciate without understanding what it represented in terms of cost relative to everything else the family owned. In most colonial households of the 17th and early 18th centuries, the feather bed was the single most valuable piece of movable property the family possessed. Probate inventories from Massachusetts, Connecticut, Virginia, and Maryland. The detailed catalogs of household goods compiled for legal and tax purposes following a death routinely list the feather bed and its associated bedding, including the bolster, pillows, blankets, and linen sheets, as the most valuable line in the document, sometimes exceeding the combined value of all other furniture in the house. Thomas Fowler of Westchester, New York, whose estate was inventoried in 1681, designated his feather bed and its bedding as a separately itemized bequest in his will, its recorded value greater than that of his working cattle. The importance of this is not simply economic. It explains why the best bed was placed in the best room of the house, why it was hung with curtains, trimmed with whatever small luxury the household could manage, and why offering a guest a place in it was understood as a significant expression of the household's hospitality and regard. The curtained four-poster bed of the colonial period was not, in its primary function, a decorative object. The heavy curtains drawn around the sleeping occupants at night created an enclosed thermal space that retained body heat against the surrounding cold of an unheated bedroom. A necessary function in a climate where winter nights in Boston or Philadelphia or Williamsburg dropped well below what any banked kitchen fire could address at a distance of 2 rooms. The fire in the central keeping room, banked for the night by 10 o'clock, provided little warmth to the sleeping chambers adjacent to it. Multiple people sharing a curtained bed contributed multiple sources of body heat to this enclosed space, and the value of shared warmth was as practical as any other consideration in the arrangement. The warming pan, a long-handled metal vessel with a hinged lid, filled with hot coals or embers and moved repeatedly between the sheets before the occupants retired, was a standard piece of household equipment in any home that could afford one, its nightly use documented in household accounts from Boston to the Chesapeake Tidewater, the ritual of warming a cold bed understood as the final preparation of the sleeping space before the curtains were drawn and the night's first sleep began. Social hierarchy expressed itself in the sleeping arrangements of the colonial household with the same precision it expressed everywhere else. In households with servants or enslaved people, those individuals slept on straw pallets on the kitchen floor or on the boards of the main room, near whatever warmth the dying fire retained. Children slept together in a trundle bed, a low frame on wheels stored beneath the main bed during the day and drawn out each evening, or in a shared attic or loft. The best bed, with its feather mattress and curtains and best linen, belonged to the head of the household and was offered to guests of equal or superior status. The household's sleeping arrangement was, in miniature, a precise map of its social architecture, each body's position in the house corresponding to its position in the order the house contained. When the second sleep ended and the household roused itself into the day, the fire rebuilt from the banked coals of the night, the bed curtains drawn back, the warming pan replaced on its hook by the hearth. The first order of business in most colonial American homes was not the preparation of food but the pouring of a drink, and the drink that waited at most colonial tables, for men and women and children alike, was not what any subsequent century would recognize as a standard morning beverage. The morning drink was small beer, served to everyone at the table, to the husband, the wife, the children of working age, the servants, and any overnight guest who had remained through to morning. Small beer was a fermented grain beverage brewed to an alcohol content of between 1 and 2% by volume, considerably weaker than the ales and porters consumed in the evenings, but fermented enough that the process of its production had killed the pathogens that made raw surface water in any settled colonial town a consistent source of illness. Wells in the closely settled neighborhoods of Boston, Philadelphia, and New York were routinely contaminated by proximity to privies, slaughterhouses, and the general organic accumulation of an 18th century streetscape, and the practical alternative to fermented drink for most colonial households was not clean spring water but something considerably more dangerous. The fermentation process was, in the complete absence of any understanding of microbial disease, functioning as a water purification technology that colonial households operated entirely without recognizing it as one. The provision of small beer to children in colonial households was not a custom that required justification in its own time because it was not understood as exceptional in any way. Household account books from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Virginia record beer allocations for children with the same matter-of-factness applied to bread and salt pork. The Boston minister and diarist Samuel Sewall, whose journal covers the years 1674 through 1729 in meticulous domestic detail, recorded the daily management of his household's beer supply as a routine administrative concern, no different in kind from the management of firewood or candles, and his records draw no meaningful distinction between the beer allocated to adult members of the household and that provided to the children and servants who ate at the same table. In New England farm households, where grain was relatively expensive and apple orchards were productive and widespread, the morning drink was more commonly hard cider than small beer, a fermented apple beverage typically running to somewhere between 4 and 8% alcohol by volume, considerably stronger than small beer, and consumed at breakfast with the same unremarkable ordinariness that a later generation would attach to tea or coffee. John Adams, the Massachusetts lawyer who became the second president of the United States, recorded in his diary in the 1760s that his morning draught of hard cider had been his habit since childhood, and that he found it a dependable beginning to the working day. Adams was not describing an unusual personal indulgence. He was describing the standard dietary practice of the rural New England household in which he had grown up, as the son of a Braintree farmer, in a region where cider was the most available and affordable fermented beverage, and where the alternative, well, water of uncertain provenance, carried risks that any person who had lived through a colonial summer in a settled town had reason to weigh seriously. The broader consumption figures for colonial America are grounded not in impressionistic accounts, but in production records, import data, and contemporaneous surveys, and they are substantial by any comparison with later periods. The historian W.J. Rorabaugh, in his 1979 study, The Alcoholic Republic. An American tradition calculated that by 1790, the average American above the age of 15 consumed approximately 5.5 gallons of distilled spirits annually, not including beer, cider, and wine as separate categories. The comparable figure for the early 21st century is approximately 2 gallons of distilled spirits per adult per year, meaning that colonial Americans consumed distilled alcohol at roughly 2.5 times the per capita rate of their 21st century descendants. The observation does not indicate widespread dysfunction. It reflects a specific set of material conditions. The low cost of distilled spirits relative to other beverages, the institutional structure of a society organized around the tavern as its primary civic space, and the complete absence of the safe, non-alcoholic alternatives that later centuries came to treat as ordinary. The distilled spirit that shaped colonial American drinking most completely was rum, and rum's presence on colonial tables was inseparable from one of the most consequential commercial systems in the history of the Atlantic world. Molasses, the thick, dark byproduct of Caribbean sugar refining, arrived in New England ports in enormous quantities throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly from the British Caribbean colonies of Barbados, Jamaica, and Antigua. New England distilleries converted this molasses into rum at a scale that made the region one of the most significant producers of distilled spirits anywhere in the Western world. By 1760, Massachusetts alone operated more than 60 distilleries, and Rhode Island's port of Newport had developed a rum-producing capacity so substantial that the trade dominated the town's commercial economy for much of the 18th century. The Molasses Act of 1733, passed by the British Parliament and placing a tax of 6 pence per gallon on molasses imported from non-British Caribbean colonies, was understood immediately throughout New England as an existential threat to this industry, and it was largely circumvented through systematic smuggling from the first year of its operation. Its successor, the Sugar Act of 1764, which imposed actual enforcement mechanisms that the Molasses Act had lacked, proved to be one of the earliest and most consequential triggers of organized colonial political resistance. The economic architecture of the rum trade connected the colonial table to the Atlantic slave trade in a relationship that was direct and well understood in its own time, though it was rarely named as such in the household documents that recorded the daily consumption of the product it created. The triangular route ran from New England ports, most significantly Boston, Newport, and Providence, to the west coast of Africa, where New England rum served as a primary trading commodity in the purchase of enslaved people, who were then transported to the Caribbean sugar plantations whose molasses returned to New England to be distilled into more rum. Peter Faneuil of Boston, the merchant whose fortune funded the construction of Faneuil Hall, the marketplace and civic assembly space completed in 1742 that became a significant site of pre-revolutionary political debate, derived substantial portions of that fortune from participation in the slave trade. The morning drink of the New England household, whether small beer or hard cider or rum, was embedded in a commercial system of a particular and unsentimental kind, and the tavern in which much of it was consumed was sustained by the same economics. Sugar, the commodity at the origin of this chain, occupied a place in the colonial household that has no precise modern equivalent. not a daily staple, but a luxury of sufficient value that in prosperous households it was stored in a locked wooden container called a sugar box, the key held by the mistress of the house, and the contents dispensed in measured quantities for specific preparations. Refined white sugar arrived in the colonies from the Caribbean by way of the same trade networks that carried molasses, but in its refined form it was substantially more expensive, and for the majority of colonial households it was an ingredient reserved for special occasions, for preparations served to guests, and for the demonstration of hospitality and social standing. Household inventories from Boston and Philadelphia from the late 17th century record refined sugar among locked stores alongside imported spices and dried currants. The locked storage indicating a level of value that placed it closer in the domestic economy to medicine than to food. Molasses, sugar's unrefined predecessor in the same production chain, was cheaper and more broadly accessible and served as the everyday sweetener of ordinary colonial households throughout the period, going into the cornbread and the baked beans and the rum punch that marked the ordinary rhythms of colonial domestic life. The tavern's significance in colonial life exceeded its function as a drinking establishment by so considerable a margin that describing it primarily as a place for drinking is to mistake an institution for one of its lesser features. The colonial tavern was licensed by the county court, which held the authority to revoke the license of any keeper found running a disorderly house or serving known drunkards, and the conditions of the license in most colonies required the keeper to provide food, lodging, and stabling for horses, making the tavern keeper a regulated public official responsible for specific community services rather than simply a private businessman pursuing his own profit. In the absence of hotels, post offices, courthouses, and dedicated civic halls in most colonial communities for most of the colonial period, the tavern was the institutional space that substituted for all of them at once. The civic functions concentrated under one tavern roof were numerous and in most towns irreplaceable because there was nowhere else for them to occur. The tavern received and distributed the mail that arrived with the post rider, giving the keeper access to more information about the surrounding region than almost anyone else in the community, and the common room became the space where news of ship arrivals, of crop prices, of political developments in the colonial capital was first heard and discussed. The county justice conducted hearings and recorded legal transactions at a tavern table in the many communities that lacked purpose-built courthouses. Town meetings, church vestry gatherings, militia company musters, and the informal commercial negotiations that formed a significant portion of colonial economic life all took place in the tavern's common room, at its shared tables, and in the private rooms that the better establishments maintained for meetings requiring a degree of discretion. The Blue Anchor Tavern in Philadelphia, established in the 1680s on the city's waterfront, and occupying a position that made it among the first public buildings encountered by new arrivals to Pennsylvania, disembarking from the Delaware River, served as a port of entry institution for Pennsylvania's immigrant population for decades and hosted civic gatherings from the earliest years of the colony. The Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg, Virginia, established in the early 18th century and named after the Elizabethan navigator Sir Walter Raleigh, served as the effective second capital of colonial Virginia on multiple occasions when political circumstances required a meeting place outside the direct supervision of the royal governor. In 1769, after Governor Bouttourt dissolved the Virginia House of Burgesses for passing resolves against the Townshend Acts, the members reconvened at the Raleigh Tavern and continued their deliberations in its Apollo Room, a large, well-appointed chamber on the upper floor, specifically maintained for gatherings of this kind, whose decorative mantelpiece bore the Latin motto Hilaritas, Sapientiae et bonae vitae proles, meaning jollity, the offspring of wisdom and good living, a sentiment that managed to be simultaneously appropriate to a tavern and to a legislative assembly. The Green Dragon Tavern in Boston, which stood on Union Street from 1654 until its demolition in 1832, served the Sons of Liberty, the Boston Caucus, and several Masonic lodges as a regular meeting space throughout the 1760s and 1770s. Daniel Webster, speaking some decades after the Revolutionary period, described it as the headquarters of the Revolution, a retrospective characterization grounded in documented fact. Paul Revere and his network of observers used the Green Dragon as a gathering point for intelligence and information about British troop movements that preceded the events of April 1775 was discussed and evaluated in part in its common room. The architectural function of the tavern as the primary space of political assembly in colonial Boston was not incidental to the history of the Revolution. The arguments that became independence were made, refined, and mobilized, not in purpose-built legislative chambers, but around the common tables of licensed establishments that happened to be the only warm, consistently lit, and regularly occupied civic spaces available. The social rituals organized around those tavern tables extended into the formal institutions of colonial politics through the practice of treating. The provision of free food and drink by a political candidate to the voters of his district, at the candidate's expense and typically at the local tavern, as a recognized and expected component of any electoral campaign. The practice was not considered corrupt or improper by colonial standards. It was understood as the candidate's demonstration of generosity, of his ability to sustain social reciprocity, and of his genuine engagement with the community whose representation he was seeking. George Washington spent considerable sums treating the voters of Frederick County, Virginia, during his successful campaign for a seat in the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1758, providing approximately 144 gallons of rum, beer, wine, and hard cider for approximately 391 voters. Washington did not find the arrangement unusual or the expense troubling. The candidate who treated poorly risked being perceived as miserly and indifferent to his community, a perception considerably more damaging in colonial Virginia than the financial cost of a generous evening. The common table at which voters ate and drank their candidates' provisions was organized around dining customs recognizable in their general social outlines but foreign in nearly every material detail. The fork, as a standard piece of individual table equipment, did not appear routinely on colonial American tables until the early 18th century and spread through the population only gradually over subsequent decades, arriving in ordinary households at different points in different regions through the course of the century. Before its adoption, food was taken from a communal dish using a spoon and a knife, conveyed to the mouth with the assistance of the fingers, and placed on a wooden trencher, a flat board or shallow tray, rather than on an individual ceramic plate. Individual ceramic plates became available to prosperous colonial households in the early decades of the 18th century and moved slowly through the economic spectrum from there, their presence in a household's probate inventory serving as a reliable indicator of the household's relative prosperity. The food placed on those trenchers was, in most colonial households through most of the colonial period, monotonous in a way that is difficult to appreciate from a position of ordinary modern food abundance. The single most common meal across colonial American households for most of the 17th century was some form of pottage, a boiled mixture of grain, root vegetables, dried legumes, and whatever fat or protein the household stores contained, most commonly salt pork or dried fish. It appeared on the table with variations in its particular components, but no fundamental variation in its form from one season to the next, one day to the next, one year to the next. Philip Vickers Fithian, the Princeton-educated tutor who spent a year at Nominee Hall Plantation in Virginia in 1773 and 1774 and kept a journal of considerable documentary value, recorded the elaborate dining customs of the Virginia planter gentry with evident admiration, but the distance between those customs and the eating habits of ordinary colonial Virginians was as wide as any social gulf in the colonies. Corn, the crop indigenous to the Americas, unknown in Europe before the 16th century, became the dietary foundation of colonial American life with a thoroughness that permanently reshaped the food architecture of the European-descended population. By the mid-17th century, every colonial region depended on maize as its primary grain crop, because corn thrived in North American soil and climate conditions that wheat often found difficult, produced reliable yields with less labor than European grains, and could be processed at the household level rather than requiring the millstone infrastructure that wheat demanded. Cornmeal mush, hominy, cornbread, and dried corn appeared on colonial tables in the morning, at midday, and in the evening, sustained through the winter months by the dried stores laid in during harvest, and accompanied by the salt pork and dried beans that completed the standard colonial diet. The management of that diet, its daily transformation from preserved grain and salted protein into something edible, required sustained daily labor from the women who performed it at the kitchen hearth that was the architectural and thermal center of the colonial home. The distance between that hearth and the tavern common room where rum was poured and legislative resolves were assembled was not large, and the two spaces formed the twin institutional poles of colonial daily life. The domestic economy and the civic institution, the morning draft of small beer and the evening argument over taxation and liberty. Both were defined by the material constraints of what was physically available, and both shaped behavior in ways that were entirely coherent within those constraints and entirely strange from the vantage point of the centuries that came after. The body that consumed small beer at the household hearth and rum at the tavern table was, in the understanding of the colonial period, a body governed by specific interior mechanisms that the era's physicians believed they could read and correct. And the corrections they applied were, in nearly every case, interventions that a modern clinician would find considerably more alarming than the conditions they had been designed to treat. The county court that licensed the tavern keeper and supervised the management of his establishment was the same institution responsible for the administration of colonial justice and the public spaces around which colonial civic life organized itself. The town common, the market square, the meeting house steps served, when occasion required, as the architectural setting for colonial punishment, as readily as they served as the setting for commerce, election, and assembly. This alignment of civic and judicial space was a consequence of institutional architecture rather than casual design. The colonial justice system before approximately 1790 possessed no prisons in the modern sense, no purpose-built facilities designed to hold offenders for extended periods as a form of punishment in themselves. The county jail existed as a holding space, confining persons awaiting trial, awaiting the payment of a fine, or awaiting transportation to some other judicial disposition, but the sustained incarceration of a convicted person. The idea that removal from public life for a period of years might itself constitute the sanction was not a feature of colonial American legal practice. The first American institution recognizable as a penitentiary in the modern reformative sense, the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, did not receive its reconstituted purpose until 1790, and the theoretical framework that supported it, developed by Philadelphia Quakers drawing on Enlightenment arguments about the reformation of character, had no equivalent in the legal. Thinking of the earlier colonial period, what existed in its place was a system built entirely from public space and the public body, employing the town common and the market square as the theater and infrastructure of justice. The stocks and the pillory, maintained at public expense in every colonial town of any size, were the primary instruments of this system. The stocks, two hinged boards with holes cut to accommodate the ankles of a seated offender, were applied for minor offenses: public drunkenness, minor theft, disorderly conduct. The pillory, a standing frame that held the head and wrists simultaneously, was reserved for more serious or more publicly consequential violations: fraud, slander, forgery, and unlicensed trading. Both devices required the offender to remain in place at a location of maximum public visibility for a duration prescribed by the court, typically between 1 and 3 hours, at times specifically chosen for the size of the audience they would attract. Market day, the hours surrounding the Sunday meeting, the period immediately following a weekly court session. The public that gathered during this time was not a passive audience in the colonial understanding of the procedure. The community was an active and expected participant in the sanction, and the hurling of rotten produce, spoiled eggs, mud, and other materials at a pilloried offender was a well-documented practice that courts generally regarded as a legitimate extension of collective judgment, moderating only in cases where the thrown materials escalated to stones or other potentially lethal objects. An offender who had wronged the community significantly could expect the full weight of that community's assessment delivered in physical and olfactory terms across the duration of their time in the device. The range of offenses punished at the pillory extended into economic life with a directness that reflects the colonial understanding of commerce as a matter of community moral architecture. In 1639, Robert Kane, a prosperous Boston merchant and the founder of what later became the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company of Massachusetts, was brought before the Massachusetts General Court on charges of oppressive gain. The court's term for the practice of charging prices in excess of what the community's standards of Christian fairness permitted. The specific items involved were bags and nails and buttons, and the margin Kane had charged on them, though consistent with the commercial norms of his English trading background, was judged by the court to violate the Puritan community's obligation to conduct commerce as a form of mutual service rather than personal enrichment. Kane was fined £200, the largest civil fine the Massachusetts General Court had imposed to that date, and was additionally censured by the Boston Church, which found his conduct in violation of his religious duties as a member of the community. The case did not result in the pillory in the end. Kane's eventual partial repentance and his established social position moderated the court's disposition, but he spent the remaining years of his life composing a lengthy written defense of his conduct, a document of approximately 50,000 words now held at the Massachusetts Historical Society, which stands as perhaps the most elaborate single piece of evidence for the psychological weight that the colonial Massachusetts community's commercial judgment could place upon an individual who had been found wanting. Physical sanctions at the pillory included, for categories of offense deemed serious enough to warrant them, the procedure of ear nailing, documented in the official records of the Massachusetts General Court with sufficient specificity to place it beyond the category of historical legend. The offender's ear was fastened to the pillory board by a nail driven through the cartilage, and after a set duration, the offender was expected to pull free without assistance. The Massachusetts General Court applied ear nailing and its companion punishment, ear cropping, the physical removal of a portion of the ear by a court officer using a blade, with particular frequency to Quaker preachers who returned to the colony after having been formally expelled. The General Court's law of 1658 prescribed that any Quaker who had been expelled from Massachusetts and returned to the colony was to have one ear removed for the first return and the other for the second, with boring through the tongue with a hot iron reserved for a third violation. Christopher Holder, a Quaker minister from England who had already been imprisoned and physically punished in Massachusetts before expulsion, was subjected to ear cropping upon a subsequent return. In 1661, King Charles II, presented with a petition documenting these practices by Quaker representatives who had traveled to London specifically for the purpose, issued a royal order requiring Massachusetts to cease the physical punishment of Quakers and refer such cases to the Crown for disposition, a directive that the Massachusetts General Court acknowledged in formal language, while finding administrative means to delay full compliance for several additional years. Branding with heated iron instruments was applied in colonial courts for offenses that included theft, forgery, manslaughter, and blasphemy, with different letters designating different categories of crime across different colonies, the marked body becoming a permanent portable record of the court's judgment. Virginia colony records from the 1640s and 1650s document branding applied for categories of violent crime and for repeat theft. In the Puritan colonies of New England, the marking of letters was applied more often to clothing than directly to skin. Persons convicted of adultery in Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth Colony were in several documented cases required to wear a visible letter upon their outer garments at all times when in public, as a permanent and continuously displayed record of their offense, accessible to any person who encountered them in the street, at meeting, or in the market. Plymouth Colony records from the 1650s and 1660s contain multiple cases of this kind, and it is these records, along with the general institutional practice of letter-wearing as public penance in colonial New England courts, that provided Nathaniel Hawthorne with the historical foundation for his 1850 novel The Scarlet Letter, whose central image of a woman required by a colonial court to wear an embroidered letter upon her dress was drawn not from invention but from the documented practice of the colonial judicial record. The ducking stool occupied a specific institutional niche in the colonial management of female public behavior, applied most extensively in the Chesapeake colonies of Virginia and Maryland. The device consisted of a long wooden arm mounted on a pivot over a body of water, a mill pond, a river crossing, or a purpose-constructed pool in larger market towns, with a chair fastened at the outer end. The offender, almost invariably a woman convicted by the county court of being a common scold, a legal category covering women judged by their neighbors or their husbands to be persistently argumentative, disruptively loud in public, or destructive to community peace through the sustained use of speech, was seated and secured in the chair and submerged a number of times prescribed by the court according to the severity of the case. Northampton County in Virginia ordered the construction of a ducking stool in 1632, a date close enough to the earliest years of permanent Virginia settlement to place the institution among the first formal judicial mechanisms imported from English practice into the colonial American context. The court records of several Virginia counties through the 17th century document ducking stool sentences issued and executed, the public setting of the proceeding, the gathered crowd at the water's edge, the exposed and soaked offender visible to all present, serving the same institutional function as the pillory, the correction of individual conduct through the mechanism of communal witness and the subjection of the offending body to public view. On May 11, 1659, the Massachusetts General Court passed legislation making the observance of Christmas a finable offense throughout the Massachusetts Bay Colony, with a penalty of 5 shillings imposed on any person found observing any such day as Christmas or the like, either by forbearing of labor, feasting, or any other way. The theological reasoning supporting the law was precise and, within its own framework, entirely consistent. The Puritan Reformed tradition held that December 25 had no scriptural sanction as the date of Christ's birth, that the date had been assigned by the early Catholic Church on the basis of its proximity to pre-Christian Roman festivals rather than on any documented historical relationship to the events it purported to commemorate. The customs associated with Christmas observance, the cessation of ordinary labor, the feasting and the drinking, the various folk traditions of the season involving evergreen decoration, candles, and the exchange of gifts, were identified by Puritan theologians as pagan in their origins, socially disruptive in their practice, and incompatible with the discipline and sober purposefulness that a Reformed Protestant community was theologically obligated to maintain. The law was not understood by those who passed it as an assault on religious observance. It was understood, in the language of the General Court's own proceedings, as the protection of genuine religion from the corruption of unsanctioned tradition. The legislation remained in force until 1681, when English political pressure associated with the crown of Charles II produced its repeal. But the cultural architecture it had established proved durable in ways that outlasted the law itself by a considerable margin. Boston's public schools did not officially close on Christmas Day until the year 1870, nearly 2 centuries after the original prohibition had been lifted from the statute books. The regulation of Sunday behavior across the colonies extended the same institutional logic into every week of the year throughout the colonial period and well beyond. Laws governing Sunday conduct in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Virginia, and several other colonies derived from the English Sabbatarian tradition, applied in the New England settlements with a legislative thoroughness that the Church of England had itself never achieved in practice at home. Massachusetts statutes prohibited unnecessary travel on Sundays, the conduct of any commerce, the playing of musical instruments for entertainment, and any form of recreation, not specifically sanctioned by established religious custom, with fines collected in the town court records with the routine regularity of any other administrative tax throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. The Reverend Samuel Peters, an Anglican minister who documented New England customs in his 1781 General History of Connecticut, a text whose reliability is complicated by Peters's evident satirical purposes and by the political circumstances of its composition, as Peters had been expelled from Connecticut as a loyalist during the Revolutionary years and was writing his account from England in conditions that provided ample motive for embellishment, described a body of Connecticut Sunday laws prohibiting cooking, shaving, cutting hair, and kissing one's spouse in public on the Sabbath. Historians examining the primary records have found independent documentary support for some of these claims and not for others, making Peters's compilation useful as evidence of the general cultural character of New England Sunday regulation while requiring some caution about its specific details. The warning out system, operating across New England from the earliest decades of settlement and persisting into the post-revolutionary period, was among the more architecturally revealing mechanisms of colonial social administration. The procedure assigned to the overseers of the poor, officials appointed annually by each town's selectmen, the responsibility of monitoring newcomers and assessing their likely economic trajectories within the community. When the overseers determined that a new arrival appeared likely at some future point to require relief from the town's poverty funds, they could apply to the local magistrate for an order formally warning the person out of the town. Warning out did not require immediate departure. It functioned as a legal declaration. The person received formal notice that their settlement was recorded as not legally established, and that if they subsequently fell into poverty, the town bore no legal obligation to support them through its poor relief mechanisms and retain the statutory authority to remove them by force. The legal and financial architecture of the system was its essential function. Colonial towns were legally responsible for the maintenance of their settled poor, and the warning out procedure was the institutional mechanism by which that financial liability was mapped, bounded, and maintained against the claims of those who had not yet established a legal settlement. The historian Josiah Henry Benton, in his 1911 study Warning Out in New England, documented the Boston warning out records covering the years 1740 through 1742, finding approximately 267 formal warnings issued across roughly 24 months, an average exceeding 10 per month in a town of approximately 16,000 residents. The records of Salem and Providence tell similar stories. The population most consistently subjected to warning out proceedings was not the recently arrived tradesman establishing a business, whose economic productivity was actively valued, but the widow without family resources, the elderly person whose children could not or would not provide for them, the laborer whose capacity for work had been diminished by injury or illness, and the free black resident of a colonial New England town. A demographic group whose appearance in warning out records was substantially disproportionate to their numbers in the general population throughout the colonial period and into the decades that followed. Debt imprisonment, inherited from English common law and applied throughout the colonial justice system, made the experience of judicial confinement for financial failure one of the most commonly encountered institutional experiences in colonial American life. The internal incoherence of the arrangement, that the imprisonment of a debtor prevented the debtor from earning the money necessary to resolve the debt, potentially extending the period of confinement without limit. was acknowledged in colonial legal commentary without resolution. A debtor who had no family patron willing to settle the account and no assignable assets for the court to direct to the creditor might remain in confinement indefinitely, the original debt accumulating interest while the debtor's productive capacity was entirely suspended. The conditions of confinement varied considerably according to the debtor's social standing and resources. A person of some means and connections might be permitted a private room at the keeper's house, with family allowed to bring provisions from outside, preserving some of the forms of ordinary domestic life within the carceral arrangement. A debtor without resources or connections experienced something considerably closer to simple deprivation. The Bankruptcy Act passed by the United States Congress in the year 1800 provided the first federal mechanism for the orderly resolution of insolvency. But through the entire colonial period and the first decade of the Republic, the architecture of debt imprisonment offered no systematic exit to the person whose debts exceeded their means. Sumptuary laws, which regulated the clothing and material possessions that colonial residents of different social and economic positions were legally permitted to own and display, extended the institutional reach of colonial governance into the most immediate and personal aspects of daily appearance. The Massachusetts General Court's legislation of 1651 forbade persons of insufficient estate. Specifically, those with a recorded property value below 200 pounds, from wearing gold or silver lace, silk hoods, silk scarves, or fashions determined to exceed their social position, with fines for violation recorded in town court proceedings. The purpose was not exclusively or even primarily moral in the narrower sense. In a colonial society possessing no system of inherited titles, no formal visual markers of rank visible at a distance, and no uniforms distinguishing the merchant from the indentured servant or the established tradesman from the newly arrived laborer, clothing was the primary legible indicator of social position in any public encounter. Its regulation was understood as maintaining the readability of the social order, ensuring that the institutional hierarchy of the community was visible in the street, at the market, and in the meeting house, as well as on the court record and the church membership roll. The most informal expression of the same institutional impulse was the community ritual known in England and in the colonies as the skimmington ride, or rough music. When a household's internal arrangements violated the community's settled expectations of proper gender conduct, when a man was widely known to have been regularly struck or controlled by his wife, when a woman's husband was publicly identified as having committed adultery, when a couple's domestic arrangements had become sustained neighborhood conversation, neighbors might organize a nighttime procession outside the household, bringing drums, pots, bells, and whatever instruments of noise were available, singing bawdy and specific songs and carrying effigies representing the household's disgrace in terms clear enough that every person on the street understood precisely who was being addressed. The ritual required no court order and no magistrate's authorization. It was the community exercising its social authority through the architectural resources immediately available. The street outside the offender's door, the network of neighboring houses whose occupants constituted both the performers and the audience, and the nighttime darkness that provided enough cover for participation while ensuring the sound reached every surrounding household. The formal colonial courts neither authorized the skimmington ride nor particularly wished to suppress it, finding the institution a useful supplement to the formal system's limited capacity to manage the full texture of community social life. The body that was pilloried, worn down, required to wear a letter upon its clothing, or subjected to the collective noise of a neighborhood's organized judgment was, in the colonial framework of understanding, a social and institutional body as much as a physical one. A unit whose conduct was the legitimate concern of the community's legal structures, subject to correction by the architectural resources those structures made available. What that same body experienced when illness arrived and the physician was called was shaped by a theoretical framework equally coherent and, in its practical consequences, considerably more immediately dangerous, and the corrections its physicians applied were, by the measure of any later century, in several notable respects more damaging than the conditions they had been engaged to treat. The physician who arrived at a colonial sickbed in Boston or Philadelphia or Williamsburg in the year 1730 carried a set of tools whose primary ends, orchestrated colonial medicine section with humoral theory and historical figures, orchestrated colonial medicine section with humoral theory and historical figures. The physician who arrived at a colonial sickbed in Boston or Philadelphia or Williamsburg in the year 1730 carried a set of tools whose primary instruments were the lancet and the leech, and a body of theoretical knowledge whose intellectual foundation had been laid by the Greek physician Galen of Pergamon in the 2nd century of the Common Era, transmitted through Arabic scholarship and Renaissance European medical education to arrive, essentially intact, at the bedside of the colonial patient some 1,500 years after Galen had first assembled it. Galen's framework organized human health around the concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These four substances were understood to exist in the body in proportions that, when properly balanced, produced health, and whose imbalance produced illness in forms corresponding to whichever humor was in excess. Blood, associated with warmth and moisture, accumulated in surplus as fevers, inflammations, and conditions of the lungs and chest. Phlegm, cold and wet, produced the respiratory ailments whose visible characteristics appeared to match the substance attributed to them. Yellow bile generated jaundice, agitation, and disorders associated with the liver. Black bile, cold and dry, produced the conditions of sustained melancholy, depression, and the heavier, slower ailments of the abdomen. The physician's task was diagnostic, identifying which humor was in excess, and the primary correction for excess blood, the humor most commonly implicated in the conditions presenting to the colonial practitioner, was the intentional removal of that blood from the body by cutting a vein with a lancet, or by applying leeches to specific anatomical locations determined by the correspondence between bodily regions and the humoral map that Galenic anatomy had established. The practice was applied to virtually every presenting condition in the colonial medical repertoire. Fever was treated with bloodletting on the reasoning that fever indicated excess blood producing excess heat, and that removal would cool the body toward equilibrium. Headache, respiratory illness, chest pain, inflammation at any location, complications of childbirth, and the condition of sustained low mood identified as melancholy were all understood as conditions of excess that the removal of blood could address. The volume removed in a single session was not trivial. A practitioner might take between 16 and 30 ounces of blood in a single procedure, repeating the procedure at intervals determined by the patient's apparent response, with multiple bleedings within a single day not uncommon in conditions the physician regarded as severe. Benjamin Rush, the Philadelphia physician who had trained in Edinburgh, served as professor of chemistry and then of medicine at the College of Philadelphia, signed the Declaration of Independence as a Pennsylvania delegate, and occupied a position of professional authority in the New Republic's medical community that few other practitioners could match, was one of the most publicly committed advocates of aggressive bloodletting in American medical history. During the yellow fever epidemic that struck Philadelphia in 1793, an epidemic that killed approximately 5,000 of the city's approximately 50,000 residents between August and November of that year, Rush prescribed sustained courses of bloodletting combined with large doses of a mercury and halap purgative that he called his 10 and 10 powder. 10 grains of calomel and 10 of yalap administered simultaneously. Rush was explicit in his published writings about the volumes of blood he was removing from patients. He advocated bleedings of up to 80 ounces across a course of treatment for severe cases, a quantity representing a substantial portion of the total blood volume of an adult, and he supervised or directed the treatment of hundreds of patients during the epidemic using this method. His contemporary and professional rival, the physician William Curry of Philadelphia, documented his objections in pamphlets published during the epidemic itself, and the argument between them became a public disagreement about the nature of yellow fever conducted in the Philadelphia newspapers, while the disease was still killing residents of the city around them. Rush was not an outlier within his own framework. He was applying the established theoretical architecture of his training with the confidence of a practitioner who had thought carefully about its principles and who believed, sincerely and without any available mechanism for testing the belief systematically, that he was helping his patients. The humoral system was internally coherent. Its predictions were not demonstrably wrong in every individual case, because the natural course of illness includes periods of apparent improvement that a practitioner could interpret as evidence of treatment efficacy regardless of what had actually produced them. The systematic comparison of outcomes between treated and untreated patients. The controlled trial as a method for determining whether a treatment's results exceeded the natural history of the disease was not a standard feature of colonial or early national medical practice, and without it, the humoral framework was insulated from the kind of evidence that would have challenged it most directly. The prescription of tobacco as a therapeutic substance occupied a similar position in the colonial medical repertoire, sustained by a combination of theoretical rationale and practical observation that was not entirely without basis. Nicholas Culpeper, the English apothecary and physician whose Complete Herbal of 1653 was among the most widely distributed medical reference works in the English-speaking world and circulated in the American colonies in multiple editions throughout the colonial period, listed tobacco as a plant with significant medicinal properties. Useful for skin diseases, headaches, and intestinal parasites, applicable by methods including the rubbing of tobacco juice into the skin, the blowing of smoke into the ear for earache, and the ingestion of tobacco preparations for worm infestations of the digestive tract. The theoretical basis within the humoral framework was that tobacco, as a hot and dry substance, could address cold and wet humoral imbalances, and the practical observation that tobacco alkaloids produced demonstrable physiological effects, and that tobacco smoke did kill or repel certain insects, gave the practice a partially valid empirical foundation that made it resistant to easy dismissal within its own explanatory context. The practitioner in colonial America was in any case operating in an environment that placed him in direct competition with a range of other practitioners whose authority rested on entirely different foundations. The formal medical licensing systems that later consolidated professional authority in the hands of university-trained physicians did not exist in the colonial period. The first American medical school, the Medical School of the College of Philadelphia, was not established until 1765, and its graduates entered a colony in which most medical practice continued to be performed by trained craftsmen, by women within their own households and communities, and by practitioners whose knowledge came from apprenticeship to established doctors rather than from any institutional training. The humoral physician's lancet, the herbal practitioner's compounded preparations, and the household mother's accumulated knowledge of which plants produced, which effects in which conditions all competed in the same unregulated space, and the colonial patient navigated between them without any institutional mechanism for evaluating the comparative reliability of what each offered. No single episode in the medical history of the colonies illustrates the complexity of this unregulated environment more fully than the smallpox inoculation controversy that unfolded in Boston in 1721. The epidemic that struck the city in the spring of that year killed approximately 844 of the approximately 5,889 residents who contracted the disease, a case fatality rate approaching 14%. And it was during this epidemic that Cotton Mather, the Puritan minister of the Second Church of Boston, published a proposal for conducting deliberate inoculations against the disease. Mather had learned of the practice of variolation, the intentional introduction of material from an active smallpox pustule into a small incision in the skin of a healthy person, producing a mild case and thereafter lifetime immunity, from an enslaved man in his household named Onesimus, who had undergone the procedure during his childhood in Africa and described it to Mather in detail during a conversation. The minister recorded in his diary around 1706. Mather had subsequently confirmed accounts of the practice in a report to the Royal Society of London describing its use in Africa and in the Ottoman Empire, and in 1721 he understood it as an empirically established intervention that Providence had made available against a disease he was watching kill his neighbors. The physician Zabdiel Boylston agreed to conduct the inoculations, performing the first in June 1721 on his own 6-year-old son and on 2 enslaved men in his household, then expanding the campaign to eventually treat 248 individuals, of whom 6, approximately 2.5%, died, compared with the 14% mortality rate among those who contracted the disease naturally in the same epidemic. The opposition that Mather and Boylston encountered was substantial. It was led, within the medical establishment, by William Douglas, the only formally licensed physician in Boston at the time and a graduate of the University of Edinburgh, who argued in published pamphlets that the inoculation practice was dangerous, that its theoretical basis was inadequate, and that Mather, as a minister, had no standing to direct medical interventions. The response from the general public included a hand grenade of the incendiary variety thrown through a window of Mather's house on November 14, 1721, with a note attached reading in part that the sender intended to inoculate Mather with its contents. The device failed to detonate. Mather recorded the event in his diary and continued supporting the inoculation campaign. The case is notable not only because it produced among the earliest documented comparative outcome data for any medical intervention in American history, but because the knowledge that made it possible was carried across the Atlantic, not by a university-trained physician, but by an enslaved man whose name, Onesimus, appears in the historical records solely because the minister who owned him chose to write it down. The relationship between cleanliness and health in the colonial period was governed by a theoretical framework that produced recommendations directly contrary to those of every subsequent era of medicine, and its institutional expression was a widespread, medically endorsed avoidance of full-body immersion in water that persisted through most of the colonial period and into the decades following it. The theoretical basis was the miasma theory of disease. The The understanding that illness was transmitted by corrupted air arising from organic decomposition, stagnant water, and the exhalations of sick bodies, entering the healthy person through the lungs and through the pores of the skin. Within this framework, bathing in warm water was understood as actively dangerous because warmth was believed to dilate the skin's pores, creating enlarged openings through which miasmatic vapors could enter the body and precipitate illness. Cold water bathing was regarded with even greater suspicion for the respiratory and circulatory shock it could produce. The observation that bathing in shared water sources was sometimes followed by illness was empirically accurate, even if the attributed mechanism was entirely wrong. Shared bathwater was a genuine vector for skin diseases, fungal infections, and parasites, and the visible association between communal bathing arrangements and subsequent illness provided direct empirical support for the medical theory opposing it, making it difficult to separate theoretical error from practical observation. The alternative endorsed by colonial physicians was dry rubbing of the skin with a rough cloth. The friction understood as removing accumulated matter without creating the pore dilation effects attributed to water, and the partial washing of the face and hands with small quantities of clean water that did not require immersion. The social consequences of these arrangements were managed through significant use of perfume, scented waters, and powder imported from England and France for the colonial upper market, and produced at the household level from botanical materials for broader use. The cleanliness of one's linen. The undergarments and shirts worn close to the skin, washed regularly and understood as performing the primary hygienic function of absorbing material from the body's surface, was a meaningful indicator of economic standing in the colonial period, and the ability to change into fresh linen frequently was a marker of prosperity in precisely the same way that the ability to maintain a powdered wig was. The fashion for full, elaborately dressed and powdered wigs spread through the colonial merchant and professional classes during the first half of the 18th century, and its origins are connected, at least in significant part, to two epidemics that preceded it. Syphilis, the disease that had been spreading through European populations since the late 1500s, produced among its later stage symptoms significant and visible hair loss, and the fungal scalp infection known as favus, which caused irregular patchy destruction of hair follicles, produced a similar result in persons with no connection to syphilis at all. King Louis XIII of France, documented to have begun wearing a wig in the early 1620s to conceal hair loss that his physicians attributed to one or both of these causes, set a precedent that became fashionable through royal adoption rather than intrinsic aesthetic merit. By the time the powdered wig was standard professional and formal attire in colonial America, from approximately 1720 to 1780, its medical origins had been entirely absorbed by its social meaning. The wig signaled legal standing, education, and the economic capacity to maintain it, requiring skilled attention. The hairpiece made from human hair or from horse or goat hair and less expensive versions needed regular washing, curling with heated irons, and powdering with wheat starch or chalk applied in a dedicated room with the wearer's face covered. The domestic architectural term for that room, still in common use, derives directly from the colonial practice it housed. The bodies that wigs adorned were, in a significant number of fashionable households, also adorned with lead. The cosmetic preparation known as cerus, white lead mixed with vinegar to produce a smooth paste applied to the face as a foundation and concealer, was in use among fashionable colonial women following European court fashion that had been standard for well over a century before American independence. The preparation produced a smooth, pale complexion understood in the aesthetic conventions of the period as a marker of indoor refinement, distinguishing the gentlewoman whose complexion had been sheltered from the laboring woman whose skin had been altered by outdoor exposure. The problem was that white lead is a cumulative neurotoxin, and long-term skin exposure produces pallor, hair thinning, skin deterioration, and neurological effects. Symptoms frequently attributed, by both the affected woman and her physician, to the underlying complexion problem that had motivated the use of cerus, and consequently treated by the application of more cerus to address the new symptoms. The existing cerus had produced. The same hands that applied cerus and wielded the lancet also extracted teeth, and in the colonial period, the practitioner responsible for tooth extraction operated under no institutional distinction from the practitioner responsible for haircuts and shaving. The barber surgeon, whose lineage traced to the Company of Barber Surgeons incorporated in England by royal charter in 1540, was the primary provider of dental and minor surgical services throughout the colonial period and into the early national era. The red and white striped pole displayed outside the barber's establishment, a fixture durable enough to persist as a recognized symbol into the present. Represented in its original context, the red of blood and the white of the bandaging cloth used in bloodletting procedures, sometimes interpreted as representing the blood-soaked cloth wound around the white pole a patient gripped during the procedure, to encourage blood flow. George Washington's dental history stands as among the most specifically documented cases of colonial dental experience available, and it differs from its most persistent popular characterization in essentially every detail. Washington began losing teeth in his early 20s and suffered from dental disease throughout his adult life, retaining only a single natural tooth by the time of his first inauguration in April 1789. The dentures constructed for his use by the dentist John Greenwood of New York, who served as Washington's primary dental practitioner from 1789 until Washington's death in 1799, were made from hippopotamus ivory, elephant ivory, walrus tusk, human teeth, and animal teeth, held together by metal springs and rivets. They did not contain wood at any point in their construction. The persistent claim of wooden dentures appears to have originated in the discolored appearance of the ivory components after long deterioration. The dentures are held at the Donald W. Reynolds Museum and Education Center at the Mount Vernon Estate in Virginia, where their composite construction is available to examination. The human teeth incorporated into Washington's dentures came from several sources, one of which is documented in a Mount Vernon account book entry from the year 1784, recording the purchase of 9 teeth from individuals at the estate. Historical analysis of the account records has identified the sellers as enslaved people at Mount Vernon, compensated at approximately 1 shilling per tooth. Whether those individuals understood the specific purpose to which their extracted teeth would be applied, or whether the transaction was conducted under conditions that made their participation genuinely voluntary in any meaningful sense, is not recoverable from the record that survives. The colonial body that had survived its physicians' attentions, or been failed by them, found itself at the end of its life. If it arrived at that end before the children it had produced and the labor relationships it had sustained were complete, becoming the subject of a set of customs organized around mortality with an intimacy and a material specificity that the later industrial management of death would entirely displace, and that the high death rates of the colonial period had made not exceptional but structurally ordinary. The mortality rates that shaped colonial American family life were not background conditions that families adapted to at a distance of philosophical abstraction, but immediate and recurrent features of household experience that appeared in church records and family Bibles, in probate inventories and personal diaries, with a frequency that made them the organizing fact of nearly every decision the colonial family made about its own continuation. In colonial New England, the estimated mortality rate for children in the first 5 years of life ran at approximately 200 to 250 deaths per 1,000 live births throughout the 17th century and into the early decades of the 18th. Meaning that between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 children born alive in a Massachusetts or Connecticut household could not be expected to survive to the age at which they became economically useful members of that household. In the Chesapeake colonies of Virginia and Maryland, particularly during the first decades of permanent settlement when the disease environment of the Tidewater proved severely incompatible with the immune histories of recently arrived European migrants, child mortality rates were higher still, and adult mortality in the first generation of Virginia settlement was severe enough that the colony's population failed to achieve natural increase for several decades, remaining dependent on continued immigration simply to maintain and expand its numbers. The demographic consequence of these mortality rates can be read in the naming records of colonial New England congregations with a directness that requires no interpretive framework. It was common practice in colonial families to give a subsequent child the first name of a sibling who had died, applied not merely to the name of a deceased first child given to a second, but repeatedly within the same family across successive deaths and births, so that the family record might show 3 children named Ebenezer, the first dying in infancy, the second surviving to early childhood before dying, and the third carrying the name to adulthood, or 2 daughters both named Abigail, with the death of the first recorded in the parish register between the birth dates of the 2. The Sewall family records of Boston illustrate the practice clearly. Samuel Sewall and his wife Hannah Hull Sewall had 14 children between 1677 and 1696, of whom several died in infancy or early childhood, and the records show the reuse of names across surviving and deceased siblings in patterns consistent with the documented practice across the broader New England community. The practice was not indicative of emotional detachment from the children who died, a conclusion that a later century's presumptions about parental feeling were inclined to apply to it, but which the available documentary evidence consistently fails to support. Samuel Sewall's diary entries recording the deaths of his children are among the most emotionally direct documents in the colonial record. His account of the death of his daughter Sarah in 1716, describing him sitting beside her for hours with extended reflections on her character and his grief occupying multiple entries in the weeks following her death. Anne Bradstreet, the Puritan poet of North Andover, Massachusetts, whose manuscript verse circulated among New England's educated households throughout the mid-17th century, composed elegies for deceased grandchildren with a plainness of documented grief that leaves no ambiguity about the emotional weight these deaths carried. In one such elegy, she described the death of a grandchild named Elizabeth at a year and a half of age in language that moves between formal theological acceptance and visible personal sorrow, with a tension that speaks directly to the experience of a woman for whom child death was structurally ordinary and emotionally devastating at the same moment. The historian Linda Pollock, who examined a substantial body of English and colonial American parental diaries in her 1983 study Forgotten Children, Parent-Child Relations from 1500 to 1900, found the evidence for intense parental grief over the deaths of young children running consistently through the record, without significant variation by century or class. The reuse of names was not a symptom of emotional disconnection, but a specific cultural practice with its own theological logic. The name was understood as belonging to the family and to the God who had created its original bearer, and passing it to a new child was an act of renewal and continuity rather than erasure. The material expression of grief in colonial American households took specific and durable forms, of which the most literally material was the preservation of hair from the body of the deceased. The practice of collecting and keeping hair from the dead, weaving it into rings, lockets, brooches, and framed memorial pictures, was widespread across colonial households of all economic levels from the 17th century onward, operating at the intersection of theological belief, material culture, and the practical problem of how to maintain a tangible connection to a person whose body had been committed to the ground. The theological dimension was not trivial. The Christian doctrine of bodily resurrection held that the physical body would be restored at the Last Judgment, and hair, being the most physically durable and easily preserved component of the human body's surface, was understood as carrying a specific physical presence in a way that a painted portrait or a written record could not replicate. The medical understanding of the period reinforced this. Hair was thought to contain vital energies derived from the body that had grown it, and its preservation was understood as maintaining those energies in a form accessible to the living. Examples of colonial mourning hair work survive in the collections of the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston, the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, and in private collections distributed throughout New England, ranging from simple rings in which a single lock of hair was set under a flat crystal face, to elaborate multi-strand weavings mounted in frames or incorporated into brooches, to microscopic pictures executed in ground-up hair pigment mixed with watercolor, depicting conventional mourning scenes featuring figures at grave sites beneath weeping willow trees. These objects were worn and displayed, shown to visitors, handed from parent to child as inheritable property, and mentioned in wills as items of significant value, their worth understood as exceeding any simple assessment of the materials they contained. The compositional vocabulary of the memorial picture became so standardized by the late 18th century that it functioned as a recognized artistic genre with its own learned conventions, taught in female academies alongside needlework, and drawing as a form of culturally important skilled production. The body from whose hair these objects were made had, in the colonial period, been prepared and displayed within the home itself, with the participation of family and neighbors in a process that the household managed directly and without professional intermediary. When a colonial American died, the body was washed and dressed by the women of the household, the female relatives and close female neighbors who constituted the community of women surrounding any given family, and laid out in the best room of the house, on a board or a table or the best bed, where it would remain for hours to several days, depending on the season, the distances family members needed to travel, and the practical requirements of coffin construction. The coffin was built by a local carpenter from wood purchased or drawn from the household's own stores, constructed to the measurements of the body, and delivered to the house before burial. The grave was dug by neighbors whose labor was understood as a form of reciprocal community service rather than any commercial transaction. William Bradford, the governor of Plymouth Colony, whose history of Plymouth Plantation constitutes one of the foundational documentary records of early colonial American life, recorded the deaths and burials of his contemporaries across the decades of that history with the matter-of-factness of a man for whom mortality and proximity was the normal condition of community existence. The sitting with the body, the practice of maintaining the presence of community members with the deceased through the night before burial, which appears consistently in colonial accounts from all regions and all denominations, served both theological and practical purposes. The theological purpose of accompanying the dead through their final hours in the physical world, and the practical purpose of monitoring a body in an era when the medical definition of death was sufficiently uncertain that anxieties about premature burial circulated in popular culture with enough persistence to be taken seriously. The professional funeral industry that would eventually make all of these domestic arrangements unnecessary did not begin to appear as an American commercial enterprise until approximately the 1850s and 1860s, when the transportation of bodies over long distances by railway, first becoming common during the Civil War, created a practical market for embalming and for funeral direction as specialized commercial services. The legal architecture governing the women who performed this domestic labor of preparation and mourning was, throughout the colonial period, built on a foundation of near-total subordination to the legal identity of the husband. The doctrine of coverture, inherited from English common law and operative in all 13 colonies, held that upon marriage a woman's legal identity was absorbed entirely into her husband's. She ceased to be a legal person capable of owning property in her own name, signing contracts, initiating or defending lawsuits, or making binding commercial agreements of any kind. William Blackstone articulated this with precision in his Commentaries on the Laws of England, published between 1765 and 1769, describing the condition in which by marriage the husband and wife became legally one person, and that person was the husband. The woman's property passed to her husband upon marriage. Her wages, if she worked for pay, belonged to him. Any inheritance she received during the marriage became his. Any debt she incurred was his legal responsibility, and any crime she committed in his presence was legally presumed to have been committed under his coercion. The practical consequences of coverture shaped the texture of daily economic life in ways that the formal legal language does not fully convey. A married woman could not buy or sell property in her own name, negotiate a lease, or enter into any commercial relationship that created binding legal obligations. She could purchase household goods on the domestic credit her husband authorized and manage the household's daily affairs with the full practical authority he delegated to her, but the legal instruments underlying those affairs were entirely his. In households where the husband was competent, present, and willing to manage financial affairs cooperatively with his wife, the practical effects of coverture might be limited in their daily disruption. In households where the husband was absent, incapacitated, or openly hostile to his wife's interests, the doctrine left the woman with essentially no legal recourse of her own. The widow, however, occupied an entirely different legal position. Upon her husband's death, a woman recovered full legal identity as a feme sole, a woman alone, with all the legal rights of a man, the ability to own and convey property, to sue and be sued, to sign contracts, and to operate a business independently in her own name. The transition was immediate and complete, and it produced a pattern in which widows, particularly widows of prosperous tradesmen and merchants, became significant commercial figures in colonial towns, managing businesses and property holdings that their husbands had established, and that they were now entirely capable of continuing. The widow Anne Smith Franklin of Newport, Rhode Island, took over the management of the printing business established by her late husband James Franklin, the older brother of Benjamin Franklin. Upon James's death in 1735, operating it as a commercial enterprise for more than 3 decades, and eventually serving as the official printer for the colony of Rhode Island, a position that gave her legal standing in the colonial institutional landscape that no married woman in the colony could have held. The Pennsylvania Feme Sole Trader Act of 1718 extended a version of this legal capacity to married women in specific defined circumstances. Primarily where the husband was absent from the colony for an extended period, was incapacitated in ways preventing him from conducting business affairs, or had effectively abandoned his family without legal provision. A married woman who qualified under the act could register herself as a feme sole trader with the county court and thereafter enter into commercial agreements with the legal standing that coverture otherwise denied her. The act was not a general extension of legal rights to married women throughout Pennsylvania. but its existence marked a recognition by the colony's legislature that the strict application of coverture doctrine in a commercial colony created practical problems severe enough to require formal institutional accommodation. The minimum legal age for marriage in colonial Virginia was set by statute at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. Ages derived from the medieval English common law presumption that puberty established the minimum physical capacity for marriage, applied without significant modification in colonial American law. In practice, most colonial women married considerably later. Studies of New England church marriage records compiled by demographic historians, including John Demos, whose 1970 book A Little Commonwealth examined family life in Plymouth Colony in careful detail, and Philip Grevin, whose 1970 study Four Generations traced family patterns across multiple generations in Andover, Massachusetts, found that the median age of first marriage for women in 17th century New England ran at approximately 20 to 22 years. And for men somewhat higher. The statutory minimum of 12 reflected not common practice but the outer boundary of legal permissibility, and cases of girls marrying at that age appear in colonial records concentrated in the Chesapeake colonies rather than New England, and more commonly in the earlier decades of settlement than in the more demographically stable communities of the 18th century. The child who grew up in a colonial household and survived to working age did not typically remain within that household until adulthood. The practice of binding out, sending children between the approximate ages of 7 and 14 to work and live in another household, either as formal apprentices learning a specific trade or as domestic and farm servants performing general labor in exchange for room, board, and some form of instruction, was widespread across all colonial regions and all social classes, and its institutional logic was embedded in the same household economic architecture that governed everything else about colonial family life. The reasoning was explicit in the contemporary sources that documented and defended the practice. Benjamin Wadsworth, the Congregationalist minister of the First Church of Boston and subsequently president of Harvard College, wrote in his 1712 Treatise A Well-Ordered Family that children under the authority of someone not bound to them by parental affection were more likely to receive the consistent correction that character formation required, because parental love inclined fathers and mothers toward an indulgence that was, in the theological framework of his argument, spiritually harmful to the child who received it. Cotton Mather expressed similar views from his own pulpit at the Second Church of Boston, and the regular production of such arguments from the city's ministerial establishment represents less a campaign to change existing practice than a theological ratification of what households throughout New England were already doing as a matter of practical economic organization. Apprenticeship contracts from Boston and Philadelphia, preserved in the collections of the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts, and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, document the standard terms of formal binding out arrangements with considerable consistency across the colonial period. The master agreed to provide adequate food, clothing, and lodging for the duration of the contract, to instruct the apprentice in the specific trade being learned, and in many contracts to provide basic literacy instruction and some level of religious education. The apprentice, or in the case of a child under 14, the child's parent or guardian signing on the child's behalf, agreed that the apprentice would serve faithfully, not absent themselves from the household without permission, not marry, and not enter into any other employment for the term of the contract, typically running from 5 to 7 years. Violation of the contract by the apprentice was a legal matter adjudicated in the county court, which held authority to extend the term of service as a penalty for sustained disobedience or extended unauthorized absence. The same contractual architecture governed indentured servitude on a larger scale, applying similar terms to the adult immigrant who used the indenture system to finance passage from England, Scotland, Ireland, or continental Europe to the American colonies. The emigrant contracted with a ship captain, a labor agent, or directly with a colonial employer. Sometimes before departure, more commonly on arrival when newly docked ships carried human cargo offered to colonial buyers at the wharves of Philadelphia, Annapolis, or the James River landings of Virginia, for a period of unfree labor typically running between 4 and 7 years. The historian David Galenson, in his 1981 study White Servitude in Colonial America. An economic analysis estimated that approximately half of all European immigrants to the American colonies south of New England arrived in indentured status between the 1620s and the 1770s, indicating that the indenture system was not a marginal feature of colonial labor supply, but its primary mechanism for recruiting, financing, and distributing immigrant workers across the colonial economy. At the completion of the indenture term, the servant was legally entitled to freedom dues. a package of compensation whose specific contents were set by colony statute and amended periodically. In Virginia, the colony's assembly specified freedom dues on multiple occasions through the 17th century, with the entitlements varying from combinations of land, corn, arms, and clothing to cash payments, as the colony's available land supply became less accessible for routine distribution. In Maryland, the freedom dues specified in mid-17th century statutes included a suit of clothing, tools appropriate to the former servant's trade, and provisions sufficient to sustain them through their first season of independent life. The underlying intention was to establish the freed servant as a self-supporting economic unit within the colonial labor force, the minimum capital necessary to prevent immediate return to dependent status, and the Assembly's periodic revision of the terms reflected the colony's ongoing assessment of what minimum provision actually accomplished this purpose. The child who had been bound out at age 10, the servant who completed an indenture at 25, and the widow who registered as a feme sole trader at 40 all navigated their particular positions within a household economic architecture that organized every relationship around the question of who produced what, who held legal claim to what had been produced, and what institutional mechanisms existed to transfer resources from those who had generated them to those who were entitled to receive them. The colonial household was, at its structural foundation, a unit of production, and the customs around death and marriage and childhood that appear most foreign from the vantage point of a later consumer society. The hair preserved in lockets, the children sent to strangers' households, the widow who became a legal person only when she was no longer a wife, were rational expressions of an economic architecture that left no member of the household outside the fundamental question of what they contributed and what they cost. The same household that organized itself around these economic calculations also organized its physical structure around a set of spiritual protections whose visible traces can still be found, for those who know where to look, carved into the oldest surviving timber frames and fireplace lintels of the colonial-built environment. Marks cut into the wood of thresholds, hearthstones, and roof beams in. Patterns intended to prevent forces understood as genuinely threatening from crossing the boundaries of the domestic space, because in the colonial world, those boundaries were understood to require structural maintenance not only against wind and cold, but against something considerably less visible and considerably more persistent. The marks cut into colonial American timber frames, most commonly found today by architectural historians and building conservators working through the oldest surviving structures of Virginia, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Maryland, are among the most overlooked and most legible traces of the colonial belief system that produced them. They appear on fireplace lintels, on the inner faces of door frames, on the undersides of floor joists, and on the surfaces of structural beams in positions that place them at the functional and symbolic boundaries of the domestic space. Thresholds where outside became inside, hearths where the domestic fire met the chimney opening onto the sky, roof timbers where the protected interior made contact with the exterior world. The most common form is the pattern known as the daisy wheel or the hexafoil, a design produced by setting a compass to a fixed radius and drawing a series of overlapping arcs, each arc passing through the center points of those adjacent to it, producing a six-petaled flower within a circle that was, in the understanding of those who made it, a self-contained geometric enclosure capable of trapping malevolent forces that entered it and preventing their passage beyond. The same pattern appears carved into medieval English church stonework, burned into the structural timbers of English farmhouses from the 14th and 15th centuries, and scratched into the walls of the Tower of London by prisoners who understood it as a protective form. Its presence in colonial American buildings reflects not an indigenous American folk practice, but a portable spiritual architecture carried across the Atlantic and applied to the new domestic spaces being constructed in the colonial environment. The marks were not decorations, and their placement was not ornamental. In the understanding of the colonial craftsmen and householders who made and commissioned them, the primary supernatural threat to a household entered through its structural openings. Most critically, the chimney, through which something not made of smoke could descend as readily as smoke rose, and the threshold, which was the primary physical boundary between the protected domestic interior and the unprotected world outside. Architectural surveys conducted in the late 20th and early 21st centuries by researchers, including the archaeologist Brian Hoggard, who has systematically cataloged apotropaic marks and concealed objects in English and colonial American buildings across a body of research spanning several decades, have documented concentrations of protective marks specifically at these structural vulnerability points, with chimney lintels and threshold beams bearing marks with a frequency that places their positioning well beyond coincidence of craft decoration and within a deliberate and consistent pattern of symbolic fortification of the most architecturally significant boundaries the household contained. The same structural logic governed the burial of witch bottles, objects whose discovery beneath the floors and foundations of colonial American buildings constitutes one of the more materially specific traces of colonial folk practice available to archaeological examination. A witch bottle was typically a salt-glazed stoneware vessel, or a glass bottle, filled with a combination of materials whose composition was specified in the folk magical tradition operating in the English-speaking world since at least the 16th century. Bent pins and iron nails, representing the entrapment and wounding of the malevolent force being deflected. Hair and nail clippings from the household members being protected, providing a material link that the protective working could follow. And urine from the intended beneficiary, whose purpose in the preparation reflected the folk theoretical understanding that the sympathetic connection between a witch and her victim operated through bodily fluids, and that filling the bottle with urine would redirect any harmful working sent along that connection back toward its source. The bottle was then sealed and buried beneath the threshold of the front door, beneath the hearthstone, or within the fabric of a wall, placed at the household's primary structural boundaries and understood to work continuously and without further attention for as long as it remained undisturbed in its location. Archaeological excavations at colonial sites in Virginia and Massachusetts have recovered examples of these assemblages with sufficient frequency and in sufficient stratigraphic context to establish that the practice was widespread across the colonial period. A witch bottle recovered from a colonial site in Williamsburg, Virginia, analyzed by archaeologists from the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, contained a combination of bent pins, nail fragments, and organic residue consistent with urine, sealed in a salt-glazed ceramic vessel and buried in a location corresponding to the primary entrance of the structure it had been placed to protect. The dating of the deposit placed it within the late 17th or early 18th century, a period in which the same community also hosted an Anglican congregation conducting regular Sunday services, a colonial courthouse administering the formal law of the Virginia colony, and a growing professional class whose members would have described themselves, in any institutional context, as adherents of an Orthodox Christian tradition having nothing in common with the material practices their household floors concealed. This coexistence between the formal theological architecture of colonial religious life and the practical magical architecture of the protected household was not experienced as contradiction within the colonial framework that contained both. The Calvinist theology governing the Congregationalist churches of New England held that God's providence was continuously active in the natural world, that supernatural forces were real and present and capable of direct physical action in human affairs, and that the line between divine and diabolical influence in daily events required constant discernment and active management. In this framework, the apotropaic mark and the witch bottle were not departures from Orthodox belief, but extensions of it into the physical structure of the household. Material expressions of the understanding that the domestic space required protection against forces that Reformed theology explicitly confirmed were real and persistent. The almanac consulted alongside the Bible, the mark carved beside the scripture text hung on the wall, the charm bottle buried under the same threshold from which morning prayer was offered. These were not signs of a confused or incoherent belief system, but of one whose boundaries between the formal and the practical, the institutional and the domestic, the theological and the material, ran in different places than any that came after it. Nowhere in colonial American history did the permeability of those boundaries produce more severe institutional consequences than in the events that unfolded in Salem Village, in Essex County, Massachusetts, in the late winter and spring of 1692. What began in January of that year with a group of young women in the household of the Reverend Samuel Parris, the minister of the Salem Village congregation, whose household included two enslaved people named Tituba and John Indian, brought from Barbados, expanded across 9 months into a crisis that involved the formal accusation of more than 200 individuals, the imprisonment of approximately 150, and the execution by hanging of 19 persons on Gallows Hill outside Salem town, with one additional man, Giles Corey of Salem Farms, pressed to death under heavy stones for refusing to enter a formal plea to the court and thereby denying the court the legal standing it required to proceed against him. The legal mechanism that made the Salem prosecutions possible at the scale and speed they achieved was the admission of spectral evidence, a doctrine holding that a witness's testimony that the spirit or specter of the accused had appeared to them in a dream or waking vision and caused them physical harm was admissible in the court of oyer and terminer as evidence of the accused's guilt. The theological rationale was precise within its own framework. Puritan doctrine held that the devil could not assume the physical form or spiritual likeness of an innocent person without that person's explicit consent, and therefore the appearance of someone's specter doing harm was evidence. Not conclusive proof, but legally admissible evidence, that the person whose form the specter wore had entered into a willing compact with the diabolical. Chief Justice William Stoughton, who presided over the Court of Oyer and Terminer, appointed by Governor William Phipps in May 1692 to handle the rapidly accumulating prosecutions, was a Harvard-educated man of substantial legal and theological training who accepted the theoretical validity of spectral evidence and applied it consistently throughout his conduct of the proceedings. The institutional collapse of the Salem prosecutions came from within the same theological community that had sustained them. Increase Mather, the senior minister of the Second Church of Boston and the most institutionally authoritative figure in New England Puritanism, presented a treatise to a gathering of Massachusetts ministers in October 1692 titled Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits Personating Men, in which he argued, carefully, with substantial reference to Reformed theological authority extending back through William Perkins and Richard Baxter, that the devil was in fact capable of assuming the likeness of an innocent person, that spectral evidence was therefore not sufficiently reliable to serve as the primary basis for a conviction, and that it was better for 10 suspected witches to go free than for one innocent person to be condemned on the basis of testimony whose theological premises could not be sustained. Governor Phipps, returning from a military campaign in the North to find that his own wife had been named in a spectral accusation, dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer in October 1692. The Superior Court convened to replace it, excluded spectral evidence as a primary basis for conviction, and resulted in no further executions. The institutional architecture that had made the proceedings possible, the court, the doctrine, the theological premises, the community's sustained collective terror, dismantled itself through the same formal legal and clerical mechanisms that had assembled it, leaving 19 people dead and the established Puritan institutional order of Massachusetts permanently and visibly damaged. Cotton Mather, Increase Mather's son and himself, a significant institutional figure as minister of the Second Church of Boston and a Fellow of the Royal Society, had published Wonders of the Invisible World in October 1692, a work endorsing the prosecutions and presenting transcripts of several trials with commentary supporting their theological validity. The book had been published at the direction of Governor Phipps and with the approval of Stoughton, and its relationship to the subsequent collapse of the proceedings was a source of sustained controversy during Mather's own lifetime. Robert Califf, a Boston cloth merchant with no formal theological training, published a systematic refutation titled More Wonders of the Invisible World in 1700, presenting a detailed and often personally sharp critique of the trial procedures and a pointed attack on Cotton Mather's conduct during the crisis. Increase Mather, then president of Harvard College, is reported to have ordered Califf's book burned in the college yard, an act that, regardless of its precise historical documentation, accurately reflects the institutional temperature of the dispute between the Mather family and their critics in the years immediately following Salem. Increase Mather's earlier work, Remarkable Providences, published in 1684 under the full title An Essay for the Recording of Illustrious Providences, was in several respects the intellectual foundation on which the Salem prosecutions subsequently built their claim to theological legitimacy. The work cataloged instances of what Mather identified as direct divine and diabolical intervention in the natural world of New England, storms of unusual violence, apparitions reported by reliable witnesses, cases of alleged demonic possession, and multiple instances of malevolent supernatural activity in colonial households that Mather had collected from correspondence across the region. Its purpose was not sensationalistic in the way a later century would use the term, but systematic. Mather genuinely believed he was assembling a body of evidence for divine providence's continuous and active management of colonial New England's affairs, evidence that would strengthen the faith of an increasingly diverse and commercially distracted colonial society. The Almanac, the Witch Bottle, and Remarkable Providences all occupied positions in the same cultural architecture, different instruments for the same underlying practice of monitoring and interpreting the supernatural activity that colonial New England understood to be occurring continuously around it, in the fields and harbors and household interiors of a world whose boundaries with the invisible were structurally thin. The Almanac was, by any available measure of circulation and daily consultation, the most widely read printed document in colonial American life after the Bible itself. Its contents organized the year's practical activities around a cosmological framework that drew no sharp boundary between astronomical calculation and providential management. The movements of the planets and the phases of the moon were read simultaneously as predictors of weather, as indicators of appropriate timing for medical procedures, including bloodletting and the application of specific herbal preparations, as guides for agricultural decisions about planting and harvest, and as reflections of the ordered structure through which Providence governed all things within the colonial theological understanding. To consult the almanac before beginning a journey of significant distance, scheduling a surgery, weaning an infant, or undertaking a major planting was not understood as superstition in the modern dismissive sense, but as the rational application of available knowledge about the structure of the providentially ordered world, in the same way that consulting a tide table before putting a boat on the water was the rational application of observation about the sea. Benjamin Franklin, who began publishing Poor Richard's Almanac annually from 1732 under the pseudonym Richard Saunders, a fictional persona presented as an impoverished and henpecked astrologer whose observations on human nature provided the publication's distinctive literary character, achieved with this almanac a circulation of approximately 10,000 copies per year in a colonial population of approximately 1 million people, a penetration rate that made it among the most broadly distributed printed documents in the colonies. Franklin himself held no sincere belief in the astrological dimensions of the almanac tradition, and his use of Richard Saunders as a fictional vehicle allowed him simultaneously to satirize the conventions of the genre and to exploit the commercial architecture of an institutional form that colonial households consulted with reliable annual regularity. Poor Richard's Almanac ran for 26 consecutive years, from 1732 to 1758, and the moral aphorisms that Franklin embedded within its conventional tables on industry, frugality, the management of time, and the relationship between personal discipline and material success, reached their colonial audience through a publication form whose authority derived insignificant, apart from its inherited role in organizing the cosmological dimensions of the year. That the most commercially and culturally successful expression of colonial Enlightenment practical philosophy arrived in the packaging of an almanac is among the more instructive details in the institutional history of colonial print culture. The Great Awakening that spread through the American colonies between approximately 1730 and 1745 drew on the same institutional architecture of colonial religious life and amplified its emotional intensity through itinerant preaching, mass outdoor gatherings, and a theological emphasis on conversion as a datable, experienceable, emotionally immediate event available to any person regardless of their formal church membership or their accumulated years of doctrinal instruction. George Whitefield, the English Methodist evangelist who made 7 extended tours of the American colonies between 1738 and his death in 1770 at Newburyport, Massachusetts, preached to outdoor gatherings in the fields outside Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, to audiences estimated in some contemporaneous accounts at tens of thousands of people, his particular vocal gifts and theatrical presence making him the most widely discussed public figure in the colonies during his periods of American residence. Benjamin Franklin, who attended one of Whitefield's Philadelphia meetings in 1739 with the express intention of calculating the size of the crowd from the audibility of Whitefield's voice at the edges of the gathered assembly, estimated an audience of approximately 30,000 people, a figure Franklin acknowledged as generous but defended on the basis of his own acoustic observations from the perimeter of the crowd. Jonathan Edwards, the Congregationalist minister of the congregation at Northampton, Massachusetts, who had been conducting his own sustained series of revivals in his community from 1734 onward, and who provided the Awakening's most rigorous theological framework through a series of published treatises on religious experience, grace, and the freedom of the will, delivered on July 8, 1741, at the First Church of Christ in Enfield, Connecticut, a sermon titled Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God that became the most widely printed and most persistently cited text of the entire colonial revival period. The sermon's central image, the unconverted soul suspended over the pit of hell by nothing more substantial than the continuing patience of a sovereign God, was elaborated across the course of the text with a deliberate, methodical, and entirely unsentimental accretion of physical and theological detail, designed within Edwards's own explicit framework not to produce emotional panic as an end in itself, but to achieve a genuine conversion of the intellect that would then produce a genuine transformation of the will. The congregation at Enfield reportedly responded with audible weeping and physical distress during the delivery, the sounds from the audience interrupting the sermon's progress on multiple occasions. Contemporaneous accounts of Great Awakening preaching sessions across New England and the Middle Colonies describe audiences falling to the ground, crying out, and experiencing physical symptoms that observers, depending on their theological sympathies, interpreted either as the direct physical manifestation of the Holy Spirit's convicting work in the assembled sinners, or as the product of manipulative, emotional arousal requiring no supernatural explanation. What the Great Awakening accelerated, among other institutional developments of considerable long-term consequence, was a fracturing of the established Congregationalist church architecture of New England into separate denominational bodies distinguished by their positions on the theological and institutional questions the revival had forced into the open. The Old Lights. Those ministers and congregations who opposed what they identified as the revival's dangerous emotional excess and maintained the institutional authority of the established church as the proper and orderly channel of religious experience. And the New Lights, who endorsed the revival and accepted direct emotional religious experience as a valid and sometimes superior form of spiritual encounter with divine realities, created between them a denominational landscape in colonial New England that reshaped American Protestant Christianity in ways whose consequences extended through the 19th century and remain legible in the 21st. The revival was, among other things, a dispute about institutional architecture, about where authority resided within the structure of religious life, and about whether the walls of the established congregation could contain the forms of religious experience that the sovereign God appeared to be generating, with some frequency and considerable force in the open fields beyond them. In the houses of the people who attended those outdoor meetings and returned home to their ordinary evenings, the witch marks remained carved into the fireplace lintels, and the charm bottles remained buried beneath the thresholds, coexisting with whatever revival theology had most recently entered through the door above them. The colonial world's spiritual architecture was layered in this way. The formal institutional and the informal domestic, the printed sermon and the carved symbol, the theological argument conducted in published pamphlets across the decade, and the quietly buried bottle meeting its appointed function beneath the floor. And the layers did not cancel each other, but accumulated, each addressing a distinct register of the anxiety that colonial life consistently generated, and that the built environment of the colonial home was, in multiple simultaneous ways, organized to contain. That architecture of the home, the tavern, the pillory, the church, the sickbed, and the night was not a collection of exotic arrangements encountered safely at historical distance, but the material expression of a coherent world, organized according to logics that the passage of time has made strange without making arbitrary, and that reward close attention with the particular clarity that comes from understanding not merely what people did, but what they were responding to when they did it. What the record of colonial American life reveals, when examined across its full material and institutional texture, is not a society organized around the strange for its own sake, but a society organized around the conditions it actually inhabited. The cold rooms and the shared beds, the contaminated wells and the fermented alternatives to them, the absence of prisons and the presence of pillories, the high child mortality and the names given again to children born in its wake, the theoretical frameworks for understanding the body that were internally coherent and empirically devastating, and the spiritual architecture built into the physical structure of the household for reasons that were, within their own context, as rational as the design of the hearth or the threshold they protected. The distance between that world and the present one is not simply a distance of time, but a distance of institutional structure, of the specific built environments, legal systems, medical frameworks, and community organizations that shaped what was possible and what was expected within any given life. When those structures changed, the behaviors they had sustained changed with them, often rapidly and without deliberate decision by any individual participant. The consolidated sleep arrived when the lamps did, the private bedroom when the heated hallway made it possible, the professional funeral director when the railway made the domestic arrangement inadequate, the individual ceramic plate when manufacture made it affordable. The colonial Americans who bundled in cold bedrooms, drank small beer at morning tables, watched their neighbors, stood in pillories on market days, and carved protective symbols into the lintels of houses they were building for permanence were not, in the final analysis, behaving strangely. They were behaving rationally within the specific architecture of their world, as people always have done, and as people always will, within whatever architecture surrounds them. The record they left behind is not a catalog of the past's failures, but a precise map of the conditions the past required its inhabitants to navigate. And maps of that kind, read carefully, have a habit of illuminating the present as much as the territory they were originally drawn to describe. Writing this script took longer than most topics I have worked on, and I want to be honest about why. The topic sounds straightforward on the surface. Weird Things About Colonial America reads at first glance like a listicle dressed in a documentary coat, and the risk with material like this is producing something that amounts to 12 disconnected surprises delivered in a calm voice. The challenge I set for myself was doing something genuinely different. giving the listener a framework rather than just a collection of historical oddities, something that held together as a single argument across 2 hours of narration. The recurring thread about the built environment and institutional architecture was the solution I landed on, and I think it earns its place. It gives the script intellectual backbone without ever becoming heavy. It is always in service of explaining the specific custom being discussed rather than existing as an end in itself, and I am genuinely pleased with how consistently it runs through all 6 sections without feeling like a hammer being used on the same nail. The sections I am most satisfied with are 1 and 4. The biphasic sleep material is extraordinary. The idea that the consolidated 8-hour sleep block is a product of artificial light rather than the natural default of human biology is exactly the kind of fact that reframes something people think they already understand. And it does it quietly and without drama, which is what this format asks for. Section 4 benefits from the cotton mather and onesimus material, which gives the medical history a specific human story at its center, and from the Washington dentures correction, which is one of the cleanest myth-to-reality moments in the whole script. The section I am least fully satisfied with is 5. The legal material on coverture and indentured servitude is accurate, and it matters. I would not cut it. But it runs through several consecutive paragraphs of relatively abstract institutional detail without the sensory grounding that anchors the stronger stretches of the script. It needed one more specific domestic scene, something equivalent to the John Adams window argument in Section 1 or the Green Dragon Tavern in Section 2, to give the listener something to picture while the legal architecture is being described. That is the passage I would revise in a second draft. Overall, though, this is a script I would want to listen to myself. It is specific enough to feel authoritative, slow enough to serve its purpose, and the material is genuinely interesting without requiring excitement to carry it. Colonial America turns out to be a rich subject for this format because the strangeness is real, the explanations are satisfying, and the two together produce the kind of sustained engagement that long-form documentary narration needs to work. That combination is harder to find than it looks. That is my honest read of it. If yours lands somewhere different, say so in the comments. Different eyes on the same material are never wasted.